fund balance to hire 10 new teachers, for example. Well, the fund balance would fund them for their first year, but the second year you no longer have fund balance available and you have a recurring expenditure. So you would then have to make a reduction to continue to fund them, right? Or you would need additional revenue. So you never want to spend one-time money on a recurring expenditure, and this is one-time money.
Okay, those are good clarifications for everybody to know about, so thanks.
I have one quick question. When are we rolling out Here Comes the Bus?
So that's a wonderful question. When we look at Here Comes the Bus, this week we've spent a lot of time trying to adjust our bus routes and making sure that we are being as safe as we can in terms of our students and efficient. We need to do more testing with Here Comes the Bus. We know that some surrounding jurisdictions have had some challenges. The most significant challenge being that the parent gets the notification that the bus is almost there, when in reality the bus has already left. Right, Here Comes the Bus in surrounding jurisdictions has had a delayed notification, right? And that's something that we know is detrimental to families. So we need to do a little bit more testing. Our goal was by the end of the month, but if the testing isn't showing that it's working exactly as we need, we won't roll it out.
That would definitely be a major inconvenience to get the notification after the bus has left the stop. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Any other questions from the board? Seeing none, we will move on to our next agenda item, which is 8.03, approval of first reading of policies. Ms. Minson.
Good evening. We have 3 policies for first reading tonight. The first is policy GCCB, employment of family members. This policy had previously been adopted by the school board, and there were amendments to the Virginia Code back in May 2019, and then before that in July 2018 to reflect changes to 2.2 3119. So while normally I put changes in red line that I would, or the font is black for what the VSBA recommends, red for proposed changes to the VSBA model policy, and then blue for other changes. Here I did a little bit different font to show in black what our previous policy GCCB had, in red the recommended additions to the policy from the VSBA, in blue sections where I thought we needed to make some changes to the VSBA model policy. And there is one point, I know, Mr. Anderson, thank you for emailing me with some questions to the policy. You had pointed out on line 43, page 1, that there could be a certification from the assistant superintendent to make this reflect the same language that's in the policy BBFA that we'll be talking about next. I would recommend that we change that language to COO or CAO, that one or the other positions can present and certify to members of the school board that the superintendent was not involved in the hiring decision. Any questions about this policy and the proposed changes that reflect the changes to the Virginia Code? One point on this I did want to point out on page 2, line 6, the board, when it first adopted this policy, had previously gone beyond what the VSBA had in their model policy for language, saying that the board had said that it was not permitted to, rather than, sorry, the last sentence, the employment and assignment of family members in the same organizational unit that this board had said was not permitted. The VSBA language is discouraged. We actually recently did a discussion of this with the principals and said it's still very, very strongly discouraged, but based on the fact that we're a really small community and we often do have folks apply to positions who are family members of current employees, we recommend changing the language back to what's in the VSBA model policy of discouraged. Questions?
So just, so does this cover everybody in the division? In other words, the school board employs or pays everybody who works in the division, and the superintendent recommends? Is that the process that covers everybody who works in the division, or are there people who work in the division who are not covered by this for some reason?
This should cover everyone who works in the division. The people who would be outside this, in my mind, would be independent contractors. So folks who are doing temporary jobs for us, but even most of those folks would be on, and Ms. Michael, I'm looking at you to see if I'm missing anything, like, this would include long-term subs, this would include folks who have PARs and folks who are just on a one-year contract as well. So yes, this would include everybody that we employ. But for subcontractors or,
So from an operational perspective, one of the things that we've done is we've changed the process by which we hire people to try to ensure that we're catching some of these circumstances in the process of hiring. So there's now a box in the application process that asks, are you related to anybody in the system? And then at that point, we can begin to question. So if it's a substitute, for example, where is the relative that you work with? And then we modify, adapt, and change those. So the answer to your question is yes, it applies to everybody, except for external contractors potentially, but then there's a conflict of interest piece that we would pay attention to. But I wanted to make sure that operationally everybody on the board understood that we are changing the way that we're hiring also to make sure that we're dealing with circumstances and situations before they happen going forward.
thank you. All right, if there's no other questions, I'll move on to the next policy, EFB.
Actually, I
Sure.
do have a few more to ask, but I wanted to make
Absolutely.
sure others had a chance first.
Sure.
So one point I have on this one and also on BBFA, but on this one, there's language, lines 23, for instance, and 41. I'm thinking, I'll just read the sentence, 22 and 23. A family member employed as a substitute teacher may not be employed to any greater extent than he was employed by the school board. I'd like to advocate to my colleagues that perhaps we should be using gender-neutral language, and instead of he, be saying they, for instance, or he, she, they, or something like that. So wherever there's gendered language that isn't actually necessary for the specific context, that we should be going neutral. But that's first thought. And then I have a couple of other questions.
Sure.
And one of them is lines 10 to 13.
Yes.
There's a phrase in here, you know, the prohibition doesn't apply to anybody who was employed pursuant to written contract prior to the taking of office of the superintendent or any school board member. Is it really been interpreted by the courts as any school board member or the superintendent, like for the extent of those folks' terms, or is it the particular person with which there's a
I
conflict?
think it's
Because
the
you
person
could
with
have
whom
somebody.
there's the relationship, but I don't know of any case law on that point. But my reading of that would be of the individual family members, the school board member who is related to the individual school board.
Yeah, I can imagine situations where there are school boards where there are members on there for a long time, and, you know, what does this do? But, and I also know that's in the code, because I was looking at that, but it was a question that I was trying to make sure I understood. So what I'm hearing is, we think that this is,
I think we're stuck with the language, but as far as what it means and how it'd be interpreted, I think we're on the same page.
okay,
Yeah.
all right. I think that's it for this one. I do have some other questions on other ones. Thank you.
Sure. So the next policy is EFB food services. This policy was also adopted by the board and now has been changed by additions to the legislature. So everything that is in black was previously in our policy EFB, which had been titled free and reduced price food services. Now it's just food services. Everything in red was the recommended changes from the VSBA. Everything that is in blue, everything in green is what we would recommend changing. Everything that's stricken through in red is where Kristen and I have walked through and figured out what makes sense for our division. Ms. Michael has sat down with Richard Kane. He's on board, thinks that makes sense, and we're ready to go with this. The impetus behind this, among other things in the legislature, was a requirement at Code Section 22.179.7 that would require school boards to include in their policies that no students are food shamed, that their students aren't sent home with a hand stamp or a wristband, or they're not made to do chores to cover a meal debt. We also did have a chance to talk with the principals about this model policy, and they think that it is good and makes sense, and they're on board as well. Questions about policy EFB?
we're into traditional space here where I'm going to ask a couple of questions. One is the topic, Ms. Minson, you just brought up, specifically the wristband hand stamp. So I'm curious about, on line 7 and 9, we're talking about how there'd be no wristband, no hand stamp for students who have some form of debt. Down further on the policy on line 46 and 47, it seems much broader than that, talking about nothing to overtly identify such a student, and so on. Is there something about the code, Virginia code, that actually requires those specific words, or can we broaden it? I'm just sort of curious what the issue might be there.
The specific words at 45 to 47, or at 7?
At 7 to 9.
7 to 9, the exact language in 22.1, 79.7
Okay.
says those words. Yep.
All right.
And it's talking about two different categories of students. The 7 to 9 is talking about students who incur a debt for meals for which they owe money. So a student who's not a free and reduced price lunch student who typically pays for meals, but their parent has not sent in a check for the money, or they don't have any more money on My School Bucks. The students who are referenced in lines
45 to
45 to
47.
47 are students whose parents have filled out the application and who have qualified as free and reduced lunch students. So those would not be students who would show a deficit in funding for meals because they get free meals already.
Yeah, okay, understood. I guess it's code, so we have to deal with it. It just seems like being even more general about not overtly identifying students, but I'll move on from there. And I would like to say, just as a comment, that I really like the language that you suggested as an addition on lines 96 and 97 about the principals contacting families who may need extra support to resolve this kind of a situation. I think it fits very well with our goal of having a caring community, and so I'm really, really glad to see that, so thank you.
Yeah, good job, Kristen. Any questions or comments on EFB? All right, moving on to the last policy for first reading tonight, policy BBFA. This, as I shared with you, is a bit of a beast of a policy. Again, I added in, this policy is a new policy going from our current bylaw 2.9 to the model policy from the VSBA. The content of the policy is the content of the model policy is fairly similar to what is included in our current bylaw 2.9. Normally, when I present policies for first readings, I'll talk about how they're similar, how the VSBA model policy is similar to what our current policy is, or the ways that it's different. Here, I included in blue the sections that were added from our policy. So the majority of policy BBFA is consistent with what our previous policy was. If anything is in blue in the policy, that is language that was added that we can, that I went through to figure out why was it added. Normally, for the most part, for example, on line 25, the training requirements for elected school board members, that's a new requirement in the Virginia Code. There's also they removed the definition of the word dependent, added a definition of counsel, which is the Virginia Conflict of Interest and Ethics Advisory Council, which does offer opinions and can provide advice if there are questions about conflicts of interest. A few other ways this model policy changes our current policy is it lowers the limit at which interest must be reported. Instead of having a $10,000 limit, it's a $5,000 limit. And one of the bigger points of this is that our bylaw 2.9 is called School Board Members Conflict of Interest, but it truly does apply to school board employees. And so the new title of Conflict of Interest and Disclosure of Economic Interest makes it clear that this really is conflicts of interest of any staff member who's employed by the school board, including school board members and superintendents. So while it's a fairly meaty policy, there's not very much about this policy that's going to change what we're currently doing, except for the fact it does talk about mandatory trainings, and there is a conflict of interest training that every school board member everybody who's currently on the school board has to complete by December 31st, and any newly elected school board member has to take within 2 months of being elected. There's also FOIA training that's required that can be provided by me as division counsel, because I've received that FOIA training. The changes to the model policy I tried to include in red to show where the My recommendations would be, that would be among other things, having a chief operating officer, chief academic officer being the member who certifies to the school board in writing that recommendations are based on